There we go. Now, yeah. Okay. All right. So, welcome the podcast that aims to empower the youth audiences through one-on-one discussion with speakers at various points in the neuroscientific, psychological, and medical careers. This podcast is an initiative by the Shine Project, a youth-led organization that empowers youth to pursue and engage in scientific careers. Before we introduce ourselves as your hosts today, we'd like to acknowledge that this podcast is recorded on the traditional ancestral territories of many indigenous nations across Canada. Hello everyone, welcome to our second episode of No Brain, No Gain. My name is Aditya Singhvi, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm a student in the United States who's super passionate about neuroscience. The speaker for today is currently pursuing medical humanities and neuroepidemiology at Columbia University. Outside of the classroom, she's involved in research studies on brain injury and stroke outcomes. Her passion for learning about the brain extends into many learning community education and outreach as a social entrepreneur. He's leading one of the world's largest by students neuroscience movements, impacting tens of thousands of brain enthusiasts from 119 countries. He founded Simply Neuroscience, a global nonprofit organization dedicated to expanding interdisciplinary neuroscience and
Thanks so much
psychology
for having me. Excited to chat.
outreach and awareness for young students. She's on a mission to revolutionize the world of early neuroscience education and create a world where students can pursue their curiosity and passion for the brain, regardless of their location, age, identity, or background. Please join us in welcoming our youth speaker for No Brain, No Gain, Chinmayi Balusu. Yeah, we're really excited to have you. It's been really inspiring to see
I would
your work
say
with Simply
that
Neuroscience and
I
directly
always really
today,
considered myself
the
fascinated
2022
about human
Global
anatomy,
Scientist Award.
and
Many
that was
people
sort of how I
esteem TEDx
stumbled
talks, so we're really
into the
excited to jump
brain.
into some discussion with your work.
It's kind of an odd little story, but when I was in
Right, so
middle
let's
school,
begin.
I was at a science fair,
How did your
and I don't
interest
know if you've
how did your
ever seen
interest in
those
neuroscience
interactive
grow out,
exhibits
and
where
when
they
did you know
have
this was the
brain
right field
models
for
that
you?
you can squish, play around with. So I came across one of those, and I was, 12, 13 at the time. So I remember just playing around with one and thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know how to put this back together. There's so many different pieces to this little thing. And it was sort of a mind-blowing moment, pun intended. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it all started there,
Yeah.
honestly. It was just such an innocuous little event that I look back at. And throughout high school, I just loved learning more about the biology side of the brain, seeing how everything came together. I mean, it's so complicated, but it makes sense at the same time, and I love that dichotomy between the two. So I would say, when did I know that this was like something I wanted to do for hopefully the rest of my life? It was probably later in high school as I was looking into like university programs and whatnot, getting involved in research that I could sort of see a space where I could further that interest. So I would say that time. That was in May of 2019. So that was when I was in the transition out of high school going into college.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. When did
Absolutely.
you
So, as
find,
you
when did you
mentioned in the
found
wonderful
your
intro, it's an
Simply Neuroscience
organization that's
organization?
based around connecting students to early career
Oh,
opportunities
okay.
in the neuroscience and psychology field. And the main sort of
Oh, okay.
part that stands
So,
out
since
to
you
me,
did
I'm a
found the
little biased,
organization,
of
can you talk
course,
to us like
but
about what it is and what you
our
guys have planned?
our organization's based on a very interdisciplinary model. And I don't really say that lightly at all. I think it's one of those buzzwords that tends to get thrown around a lot. But what's really important to understand is that, of course, neuroscience has science in the word itself. It is a scientific field by
There's no
design,
problem in that.
but that does not mean that it is, only encompassing science disciplines. There's really cool, let's say, like neurotechnology applications happening right now with entrepreneurship. People who are using like art therapies as a way to support people with neurological illnesses. Learning about sort of how our cognitive day-to-day functions can influence economic decisions. So all these sort of really wide-ranging things. And I think it's really important to kind of bridge that gap between saying, this is science, this is not science, but here's how these two bring together at the end of the day. And I mean, being like a medical humanities student and an epidemiology student, but kind of being in this weird binary of not technically being a STEM major, but still being a science kid at heart. That sort of has definitely it's been a lot of parallels between personal and professional experiences as well. The best of both worlds, huh? Always on that bordering line. It is difficult because a lot of opportunities in the sciences right now, as I'm sure you have personal experiences with too, are like if you consider yourself in a niche, then you're
that's
not
a
eligible
pretty
for other
interesting balance
opportunities
that you
sometimes.
found.
Like if you declare as a humanities major, you no
How do you
longer can
maintain
apply
it?
for the science fellowship, for instance. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of that, but I think it's really beautiful in that you get to meet a lot of people. Because with a medical humanities background, now I can go to the Society for
Yeah.
Neuroscience meeting because of my neuroscience research interests. I can go to neuroethics,
Yeah.
bioethics meetings, and now I can go explore like anthropology and sociology meetings as well. So I get
Yeah.
to like connect and have these mutual bonds with a lot more people. So I think it's really cool that it's not so specific. And yeah, I'm a big fan. Mhm, for sure.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah, so like I actually find it pretty interesting how you're like how you can consider as like a STEM major, but like also not in some points, but like still consider, like there's like the yes and no. Actually, that's pretty cool. All right, so
Yes. In all
back
honesty, Simply
to
Neuroscience
Simply
was my
Neuroscience.
one woman blog.
Um,
It started
we
out
all
from
know that
there.
it didn't start out as a
I would
very big
say,
like organization,
how
right?
did
Like
it
as
start
all
growing?
organizations
I
do, it
think
all
just
started
the
out very
natural
small, and then
power of social
they just
media
all these
bringing
things they do is
like-minded
grow.
folks together.
So,
I started putting on my own
what was
personals,
the
and people started coming
process
across
like
it
went into?
saying, hey, what is this about? Because I think I might have some shared experiences. And so, people join, they have ideas, and we all act on them together. So it started growing from there and there and there. We started off pretty small with like three, four teams, let's say a social media team, a writing team, a content creation team, and an awareness team. And now we've grown much, much beyond that into like initiatives have their own sub plans and whatnot.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I would say it's honestly a lot of driven ideas from the people who join and really make it their own ideas. So now, like those initial initiatives have grown into much wider things, like developing an entire online mentorship community or hosting like hackathons and fireside chats with speakers. Yeah,
Oh wow.
I'm. It's absolutely really fascinating to see. Like, it's just brand new ideas that people bring to the table, and you're like, oh my gosh, why have we never thought of that? It's so creative.
Oh wow.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's definitely a,
So cool.
like oftentimes people are like, okay, you're the CEO, like, what do you do? But it's very much like a team leadership model, which is amazing in that way
Mhm.
because, for instance, the lead of our podcast when he initially started out, it was very much like his own brain
That's
baby.
pretty cool to
And
see how
he
your
really,
one initiative
invested
started
his
like
time and effort
many,
and
many,
love
many
into building
others.
that. Um, and so every person kind of has their ownership over an idea, which I think makes it more meaningful of an experience. So it's not just like this weird leadership hierarchy where like everyone has a stake in their initiative and building the community as a whole.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that that concept of like, oh yeah, it's like my product and I want to see it grow is like a big
I
part of
think
um
identifying and
being
acknowledging that you have an
a
interest is the
proper source of
first step
motivation
because
per
a
se
lot of
for
times
like
I think people come across something and they
for like your
say,
let's say
"This looks
project.
cool.
But
I'm gonna
yeah.
bookmark it, put it in the
So
back of my
do you
head
have any
somewhere.
tips for
Come back to it in
students
maybe 10
who
years.
have an
I already
idea
know that
but
I'm
don't
gonna
really
be
know
like a
where to
computer
start?
science kid." And they're like, "Eh, neuroscience maybe some point." I think it's one thing to kind of realize you have that interest, and it's one thing to act on it. And always acting on something entirely new is tough, right? Like I was the absolute opposite. I knew nothing about coding, Python, R, whew, scary language. But like taking initial steps, that could be a lot of just
Yeah.
self-exploring. There's so much more content now than there was even like 2, 3 years ago on the internet that is lot more accessible. There's like Coursera, EDX, the self-learning platforms. There's even like YouTube, there's podcasts like these. Um, and it's so much more easy to connect with folks as well beyond your school community too, right? Like you can chat with folks in like Australia and India and Singapore who are
Hmm.
also probably, high school, college students who are also neuroscience folks. And it takes what, maybe 15 minutes of
Yeah.
Google searching. So I think my definite suggestion would be like act on it, look into it, listen to stuff what's in the field, read up on really cool
Yeah.
things. It doesn't have to be reading like really big, scary scientific journals.
Hmm.
It can be like engaging with things on even social media. There's so many science creators on Instagram and TikTok these days
Yeah.
that can help you learn about the brain in a lot more like easily understandable and approachable ways. So don't like think of it as, oh, I'm entering a super big scary field, but like how can I really pursue my little
Yeah.
interests in small steps? Yes. So, for a little bit of context on like why there's this gap in neuroscience education that we keep circling around, is that
That's an excellent explanation.
first,
Thank
outside
you for
of
that.
North America and
So,
Europe,
how do you
you're
think
probably gonna
continuing
pretty rarely
organizations like
find a
Simply
formal like
Neuroscience implement
neuroscience
curriculum and
101 or a
introduce
psych 101
neuroscientific
class
topics into
because the
school?
curriculum just has not rolled out fully. I mean, if we look at it in the US, I thankfully had the chance to take an AP psych course when I was in high school, but it was like there was only one section, 2 sections. It was such a highly course, and I could only take it during my last year of high school. So basically, like I knew I had this interest. It took 3, 4 years to get
Hmm.
there, which is it's tough to say it's unacceptable, but that's just the way that schools don't have the bandwidth. Um, Teachers don't have the bandwidth to introduce a whole neurobiology section in AP Bio when you're already worrying about are we going to cover
Yeah.
content for the AP. So it's a lot of just we can't expect teachers to cover everything, and there isn't enough material out there that fits the classroom setting. So I think like with Simply Neuroscience and other very
Hmm.
like-minded initiatives, I mean, there's many grassroots ones as well. It's about like if someone has an interest, we don't necessarily
Yeah.
have to say you're stuck to what we're doing in the classroom. Here's stuff you can do outside of the 9 to 5 or 9 to 3 of school. And hopefully also giving these sort of resources to teachers that if they have a student that comes up to them and says, hey, Mrs. Smith, I have an interest. I don't know where to go from here.
Hmm.
I trust you. Can you help me? There's honestly been, it's really interesting that there's so many guidance counselors and teachers who send students our way at Simply Neuroscience to say, maybe you should go apply for a volunteer position. They seem like they may be able to support you. So there's so much goodwill and interest. It's just that there's not enough resources and bandwidth. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Right.
Uh, yeah. I think yeah. You're pretty
Yes, you watch movies
like
after
pretty
final
relatable
exams.
with the thing that we don't really
I
learn
didn't
a
say
lot of in
that.
school.
But yeah, it's like I'm
We'll
always
probably
a little
focus on the
bit
brain for like
iffy
a
because
week or so, maybe
no shade to the
for like
physicists, but I feel like
bio,
we
and
apply
then we're gonna have to move
neuroscience
on
much
because well,
more
yeah,
every
we
day
can't
than we
do
do
organic. And then at the
physics.
end of the year, we end
I'm
up
not
doing
sitting here
absolutely
thinking
nothing
about,
because everyone's exhausted.
strings and quantum theories, but I maybe
Yep,
am thinking about
pretty
like
much
how can
it.
I build healthy sleep habits? How does my brain work? So maybe there needs to be a big curriculum shift in the future. Who knows? Wink, wink.
Yeah,
I hope so.
yeah. Mhm.
Ooh,
Yeah.
as in specific to
Yeah, it
Simply
seems like a
Neuroscience
huge
or just
mental health
broadly?
movement too. It's probably going to be coming pretty soon.
Broadly. Science education. What has to change? One,
Right,
this
so as we
interdisciplinary
can see,
aspect I
you
was
do have
talking
like a
about.
lot of
We really
experience
need
in
to stop
different
setting up
organizations and
boundaries.
levels of community in
It's a
general.
very
So what would you
archaic
like to
thing
see
that I hope is going to phase
change?
out soon. The second part is that we really need to be better about
Let's go broad.
breaking down this sort of global first world, third world divide that keeps existing. Like, why is it that more like higher income countries like the US, Canada, the UK have all these opportunities centralized and there isn't as much of like a digital connection to folks in lower middle income countries? I mean, we have the internet for God's sake. I think it took a pandemic, unfortunately, for us to like learn that hybrid learning and virtual learning was a thing. And like with the power of an internet connection and some handy time zone calculation, you can bring opportunities to a lot of folks. I mean, it's as simple as if you're a
Yeah.
club at Columbia, for instance, if we're organizing an event, we try to also provide a virtual option for people to zoom in. I mean, you could be, in Singapore in your pajamas, like I mentioned, in, like Argentina and just sign on. So it's about like taking the existing opportunities and kind of flipping that switch on of like, how can I bring this to more people? It's already, you're putting in the work. Let's just spread it to more people. Let's stop being so exclusive about it of like, oh, this is just for like American
Yeah.
students. So, yeah. Of course, it's one thing to be like, okay, let's open it up to anyone and expect 50 people to show up on Zoom, and it's one thing to actually put it into
Mhm.
motion. I think that especially at the university level, when I
Yeah.
got into undergrad, I noticed that there was so
So what do
much
you
of
propose is like
like
the
a
best way to
science
get
presence
get your
on
word out?
Twitter that was easy to tap into, for instance. I know it's always an interesting kind of an
Mhm.
avenue. I keep persuading my friends to get on Twitter because science Twitter, the bubble itself, is kind of nice sometimes. Yes, you really have to curate your feed.
Ooh.
You
Okay.
really have to be careful about who you're following. But
Yeah.
things like that, it's like you can follow along with different hashtags. And I've come across some really cool Slack communities that I heard
Yeah,
about
I don't
through
use Twitter
Twitter.
that much because
For
I'm like,
instance, a
yeah, I
few
just see
months ago,
people
I
arguing
came
on it all the
across
time.
this
So it's
org,
not, it's not,
um,
it's not
I
my
guess a
thing, you know.
community
But
that
yeah,
was
I'm gonna
just
consider it.
sparked out of a Twitter tweet. And it was from a lady
Yeah,
who, a few years back, I had
yeah.
interviewed for one of our blogs, and I followed and kept in touch with her on Twitter. Um, she's a professor, of course, but she was like, why is there no community for South Asian folks in psych and neuro? And so she started building this initiative called Sapna, which also means dream, which is a very well chosen word. So yeah, now there's like this. I'm meeting with folks from all over. We have student socials monthly basis. We're even working on like a research collab with students from that community. So it's like it's just one little spark, but now I have access to like if I post my event in that Slack, I could
Yeah.
100 people might see it. So it definitely does take a little bit of like energy and investment in creating those connections. I think for a lot of clubs, especially at high school and universities, especially if you're like a daughter chapter of an organization, what is a good one? I can't think of any. Like robotics clubs, I feel like have united national organizations. And you can, it's easier to build connections with their chapters and
Mhm.
be like, you're robotics, I'm robotics, let's do something. So I think there's things that are existing. Sometimes you have to poke people and be like, we're doing literally the same exact thing. Let's work together. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, you do have to go out of your
Yeah.
way. You do have to do some digging on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, take advantage of like mutual connections, but I feel like it's worth it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. So the broad idea here was basically again take the initiative in trying to like make
I
that
think we've been
connection to
touching
someone
on a
else
lot of
and
those
then
core
close it into
values a bit
something better.
already. I would say like concluding
Nice.
thought would be
Then,
a mindset of
for
collaboration
our
at the end of the day.
actually
I think
not last
that
question, but
from such a
how do you
young
envision
age,
an
especially
ideal
with
community
universities
where
becoming so
youth
exclusive, what
engage
are these
STEM
acceptance
regardless of
rates these
location,
days? It's
age,
been
identity,
wild.
and background?
I thought things were bad in, my time.
Yeah.
I see your guys' years. It's like, oh my goodness, this is chaotic. I know. And what happens as a result? We're also, me, me, me. What is my journey? What am I doing? And it's
Yeah.
tough to kind of get into a little bit of
Very
that
same. Yeah.
collaborative, like this opportunity is not really a good fit for me. This, like, I'm not a robotics kid, but if I saw something in robotics, I might send it to my friend who's
This is such a
involved
rough.
with robot building and whatnot. I have a friend who, for instance, works on a lot of space things like rocket building and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot with NASA. And that's not my cup of tea at all. But if I see something that's relevant, I don't want to just, scroll past it. I want to send it to her. So I think on a one-on-one level, we just really need to be
Yeah.
reciprocal, empathetic, caring human beings who want to help one another among like on a broader scale among student communities. I think recognizing like everyone has a role in a community. Um, One of the greatest examples I can think of personally is that within the Simply Neuroscience community, a lot of leadership are now transitioning into college. So they might be what, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And one of our really amazing events logistics leads, I won't say her name, but she joined when she was, I believe, an eighth grader or seventh grader. So she was what, 13 years old, 14 at the time. So I'm sure it felt intimidating for her, poor thing. I mean,
Yeah.
it feels like everyone is so much more
Yeah.
experienced, but I really just admire her courage and, stepping up, being open to feedback and understanding like I am a part of this community too. So yeah, I mean, when we're building like
Oh
global
wow.
communities and we're trying to be welcoming, it's
Yeah.
about like one, having that internal courage, and for those who are on
Yeah.
the older side of the peers, just really tapping into near peer mentorship, supporting the younger folks, keeping that cycle going because we wouldn't be where we are without the support of mentors. So it's such a simple thing to say, but just like being a mentor, giving, the favor back to the community is so important.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The smallest favors and the smallest little suggestions. Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree because I don't think I'd be able to do a bunch of things that I'm able to do without someone that told me like, yeah, I think you should maybe try this, or like, since you like these things, maybe you can give a shot at this, because those went a pretty long way.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I am not a behavioral economist by
Um,
training by any means.
um,
So I feel like
I
I do
know
have to
before you
deflect
talked
that
about
question. But I
how
mean, it just goes
our
to show how,
um
I mean, economics doesn't
our
involve
neurological
a
state could
lot of
affect
emotions,
our
even though you think
economic
it is just
decisions.
rational, it's just
Like,
barely
do you
purely
want to
based on
elaborate on that?
computers. But then you see all these, interesting stock market trends and falls, especially when like
Oh,
you hear the big Twitter
this
news, for
sounds fun.
instance, so a lot of that kind of things. It's like what kind of influences mass decisions and like mass. I don't want to use the word hysteria, but like
Yeah.
outrage and like what is going on? Everyone's kind of running around like chickens on fire, kind of a thing. So what causes that? That
Mm-hmm.
could be. I'm sure there's some psychologists working in that avenue.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, a lot of just looking at the subconscious kind of under the surface things of daily society. It's kind of scary and cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it's gonna be you. Who knows? This will be your new area in neuroscience to explore.
Yeah, that actually is pretty cool because if someone can crack how that works, then I think it'd be a pretty powerful tool.
Yes. So I
Oh,
would say I
maybe.
have the extremely
Yeah.
incredible opportunity to just be,
Right.
one
So
of the leaders of this
about
kind of a movement. So
just talk and
I've told
Simply
my parents this a
Neuroscience.
million
What do
times
you
over the
love
past few
most
years that when
about
I
the areas
was
that
that
you
ninth grader,
study, and the
starting
work
out
that you do
in like the
outside of
brain bee
studies?
competitions and whatnot, like I never imagined that I would have the opportunity to chat with some of like the leaders of the professional organizations in neuroscience. Like these are the people at the top of the field. Um, and so to have that door open and then say, I love what you're doing, and I want to support us in doing even more for the youth that are coming into the field, um, just wildest dreams. Wildest, wildest dreams. So I love that I get to be in that sort of a position every day. And
Yeah.
every email, though it may be tedious, is working towards something cool, and that's always great. Um, the tendonitis is worth it. But definitely like with Simply Neuro, I would say it's that with like studies as well, this kind of connecting with fields from really different backgrounds because there's so many doors open with being a medical humanities student, all that entails. And in like neuroepidemiology
Yeah.
especially, it's a pretty niche field. I think Columbia is one of the very few schools in the US that offers a formal training cluster for aspiring neuroepidemiologists. And I mean, the Wikipedia page is it's still kind of like a stub. It's not as big as it ought to be considering it's like longitudinal population level outcomes for a lot of diseases, which is super important.
Hmm.
So it's weird that it's like, oh my gosh, what if like my professors and my classmates and I are working towards something in the field that could potentially be, on a Wikipedia page in 20 years? That's weird and really cool. Um, so it's like every bit of science is, of course, like
Yeah.
history in the making, but sometimes I feel like it really, really is like that. So I really just appreciate the opportunity to go open different roles and put on different hats of being um, a student who's in the sciences, but also not in the sciences,
That is
being a
really cool.
researcher, sometimes not being a researcher, more of a communicator. So that's the
Hmm.
fun and joy there. Ooh. My initial reaction, I guess she's not a scientist. So my mom, I really love my
Yeah.
mom. My mom's an engineer by training, um, but I
Nice.
kind of grew up hearing her
Actually sounds
lingo,
pretty cool.
the engineering lingo.
Do you have a favorite
And
scientist
so
or like a professional
I
that you
think
look up
she
to?
was sort of my first exposures to like scientific language, of realizing that there was a hard way to say something and there was an
Nice.
easy
Yep.
way to say something. Right. Like I get that, like 8-year-old me should probably not be using those, big like technical language
Hmm.
and like no understanding those, but it's like I just got used to it so much after hearing again and again and again. And it just kind of I think primed me in thinking about like the value of science communication. Like my mom indirectly sit down an 8-year-old and kind of explain to her what things were, within the bounds of confidentiality, of course, for once. Gotta do the disclosure.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would say I really appreciate my mom for kind of doing that. I don't know whether she intended it or not. She probably did, smart lady. Um, for like people I look up to in the field, I work with this other advocacy-based organization called 500 Women Scientists. They're all about making science open and accessible and inclusive. So a lot of parallels across the science field. There's cool people doing this kind of work. Um, I would say I admire just everyone on that team because I'm honestly like the younger kid and probably the youngest member of that organization. But they have opened me with such welcoming arms, and I'm like, that's the kind of scientist I want to be. So I'm just inspired and so how
Hmm.
down to earth they are, but
Yeah.
how absolutely badass they are in their fields. I mean, one lady leads like the White House's office for a certain science division. And it's like, oh my gosh, I know you. You're so cool. So I'm a
Yeah.
science fan in that way. I'm just like, you are so cool. I want to be like you. So I would say shout out to all those ladies. They're very cool folks. Yes.
That is so cool. Yeah.
Ooh, I would say for really encouraging early interest in neuroscience, I would say that's some of my mentors here in research in the
Shout out to them.
first lab that I was involved in college. They're in the psychology department at
Shout out.
Columbia.
anyone in
they sort of
specific
really
that like sprouted your
encourage
growth in
me to
neuroscience or
explore
like medical
and say
humanities?
like, hey, you're here for the neuroscience research, but also what are you interested in outside of neuroscience? So I would say them for sure. One of them is Professor Ali, one of them is Alana C. They're amazing folks. For medical humanities, I would say there was this wonderful professor who I took a class with. It was called Pandemics, A Global History. And this was actually during the summer of 2020. So very on the nose. But she was just, her name was Professor Kavita Sivaramakrishnan, and she's at Columbia. She's a faculty member here in sociomedical sciences. And one thing was, I think, her being also of South Asian origin. I was like,
Ooh.
I see myself as hopefully being someone in your kind of a role in 20 years down the line. Um, and also her ability to like weave current, public health interventions, critique them and tie them into historical things as well. What goes wrong? What doesn't go wrong? It's always difficult to nitpick science because it's like, that did good, but it could have been better. I would say definitely her for kind of giving me that two-sided perspective of being critical and appreciative. So,
Mm-hmm.
that's the big question always, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I am hoping to apply to medical school in a few years. Still, I mean, I know that I want to be a clinician.
Nice.
I think there's a little bit of, I'm leaving the
Nice. So
door open for
speaking
the
about like
ambiguity of like what comes after medical
what you
school and
hope to be,
residency.
what are
I
your goals for
want
the
a
future?
career that allows me to be in medical
Yep.
education. Like I could see myself being a teaching or a mentoring faculty member one day. And I do want to be involved in global health work where I'm not just taking like
Mm-hmm.
6 weeks off every year, but I do want to actually go spend time in a certain place, live there, be kind of like a visiting associate, and help set up like local health system connections. So a mix of education, always, mix of global health work that's very close to home, and hopefully on like the more specific side, I think traumatic brain injury, neurotrauma, maybe the right word isn't cool because it can be devastating, but it's such an it's such an interesting it's an interesting field. Yeah, that's a good word choice. So I'd love to be involved in that avenue, neurology, radiology, anesthesiology. Who knows where it goes? Yes,
Yeah,
we're
that's
keeping
pretty
all
cool.
those doors open for that
It's
reason.
interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Ooh, the big timelines.
I mean
I
the
do
choices.
want
You
to
still have
see
a
a
bit
lot
of
more of that
time to choose,
international
but yeah.
collaboration I was talking about. Since my roots are in the US, a lot of the initial
Yeah.
roots in the first couple of years were definitely
Right.
based in the
So
US as
apart from
well.
your
There's a
future,
lot of
since
really
Simply
awesome teammates
Neuroscience
on the
is like
team
a
who
part of your
come from
life,
outside the
where do you
US,
hope
which
to
is
see it
helping
impact its
expand that
growth?
global perspective. I kind of want
Yes.
my biggest goal, my dream at the end of the day, is there's all these wonderful professional neuroscience societies out there, and I want youth to literally have a seat at that table. Not saying like, oh yeah, our activities target youth, but like literally having someone who represents our demographic to have a voice consistently. Not professors being like, I teach undergrads, I know what they want. Because I think we just have to acknowledge like times change really quickly. So youth have the perspective. And so that's one big goal. For Simply Neuroscience, I hope it can be a leading voice in that effort, I hope, and like pushing for those kinds of, I don't want to say reforms, but enhancements. There's good happening, let's make it better. As for like one initiative that I think will be really taking off in the
Mm-hmm.
next few years is our campus ambassador network. That is sort of our next big push to make hybrid learning that we were talking about earlier a reality. So we've done all this virtual learning during the pandemic. That's great. Let's actually bring it to our communities.
Yeah.
If you are like the only neuroscience enthusiast in your small town of, let's say, 5,000, 10,000 people, you're the leader by default. So let's like empower folks, give them a toolkit, a handy little, superpower backpack that they can put on and go host events and host these kind of conversations about education, mental health, and whatnot. in their own region. So not kind of relying on this sort of trickle down anymore. We want to
Yep.
be an action at the ground level. So that is the big plan. Fingers crossed. Yeah. I mean, I always like to joke and say, like, if you have a Wi-Fi connection in the middle of Antarctica, we can make neuroscience happen there too. So, sky's the limit, honestly.
That would be very cool. Because then we can have this kind of information like everywhere, you know?
Yeah, a lot. Hmm.
Yep.
So, one thing I noticed pretty early on, it's weird to say my STEM career,
What
but like
is
very early
one big
experiences
lesson
was
that you've
that
learned from
some
work
scientists and
in
researchers and
the
doctors,
STEM
maybe not so
field
much the doctors,
that
but
helped you
scientists and
like
researchers
realize something
especially,
or that helped you like a
it's
lot?
it's sometimes you start losing out a little bit of that humanistic touch of like the populations you're trying to impact. One scientist I met who was working on Alzheimer's research had never actually met an individual with Alzheimer's, and that really shook me. Um, it didn't mean that they were a bad person. They were still very, very devoted to their research, but I think putting a face to science is something that needs to really be talked about a lot more. I mean, there's folks who work on like the science research behind like for instance gender dysphoria and like looking at all these sort of mental health related topics that maybe they don't personally have experience with, or maybe they don't, they haven't really chatted to someone who's a part of the LGBTQ community. So how do they kind of draw on those experiences in their research? It's a lot of gray areas in terms of like if you don't have a personal connection, how can you go out and actually learn and listen? So I would say that was like a really big experience that spoke to me in terms of like being a brain injury and stroke researcher. Um, I'm thankful that I have not suffered a traumatic brain injury. I know of friends who've
Yeah.
suffered from concussion, which is what got me initially interested. But that kind of listening to folks who have survived a brain injury was something that I tried to focus on a lot in undergrad with different clubs and involvements. So I would say that stands out. A short and sweet answer. Um, People already usually have an interest buried somewhere deep.
Interesting.
It's just about sparking that interest. So
All
yeah,
right.
there's a lot of passion out there. We just need to go out and
Next
support it.
question. Why is engaging people from a younger age to pursue STEM interests important? Mm-hmm.
Yes, remember that sleep example I was talking about? Most people don't know what healthy sleep habits are, and sometimes I'm
I
guilty
like
of
that.
this too.
All
Right?
right.
It's like
So since you
sleep
do
hygiene is a thing.
integrate
We should
neuroscience
talk
into a
about
bunch
it
of the
more.
things you
We should
do,
talk about the
how
effects
does
of
neuroscience
caffeine on your
apply to
brain.
everyone, and
That's
what's
definitely
its
something
role
that
in
relates to a lot of
neuropsych?
folks. Um, and like the importance of good
Mm-hmm.
nutrition. Your brain and your gut have a very, very interesting relationship. Your gut is literally your second brain, is what people call it. Like what you eat is literally who you are, of course, but it's who your brain is as well. So these
Yeah.
kinds of things are like they're so subtle. But I mean, you're eating every day. You hopefully are not drinking too much coffee every day, and you are sleeping every day. That's what all humans do. So three easy examples: neuroscience is in your life. Even if you're not thinking about it, it is there. All students. Oh no.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Nice. I mean, yeah, I know a bunch of people whose sleep schedules are basically like
Yeah.
non-existent.
I think for a lot of folks, like
Yep.
exercise is their
Well,
natural
that's all of them.
stimulant. So
Then caffeine. I don't
it's a
understand
healthy
how
habit.
people
Coffee is an interesting
really
thing.
enjoy it, but they said that it
Yeah.
gives them creaky, but I see that like it'll give them energy, but then they'll be drained the next day, and then they'll need to rely on more and more and more. Yeah, yeah. Right, yeah, that's all the questions I had prepared for you today, Chinmay, and thank you so much. I retained a bunch of information and tips on something in the STEM, like the STEM field, and using grassroots ideas to reach like my entire community. And oh, my chair is very creaky. um, I hope to follow in your footsteps in like bringing together some kind of community, just like you were able to do with Simply Neuroscience. All right. Now about Simply Neuroscience. So have you ever wondered how our brain works, or simply interested in neuroscience? Simply Neuroscience is an international student-run, fiscally sponsored nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering students' interdisciplinary interests in the brain through neuroscience, psychology, education, outreach, and awareness. They connect middle school they connect middle schools
Thanks for
through
having me.
graduate
This was super
students
fun.
with free online neuroscience-related resources, opportunities, events, mentorship, and more. Join them in pursuing the brain and unlocking the future, one neuron at a time. Check them out at www.simplyneuroscience.org or on their Instagram at simplyneuroscience. And thank you, Chinmay, for joining us.
Cool. Bye.